Marcus Chen had been mining asteroids in the Outer Rim for 3 years when he found her. The salvage beacon on his modified cargo hauler had picked up debris from what looked like a luxury vessel, scattered across a field of ice and rock that had once been a comet. Most spacers would have ignored the wreckage. Luxury ships meant wealthy owners, and wealthy owners meant lawyers, investigations, and complications that a simple asteroid miner couldn't afford, but Marcus had always been too. Curious for his own good, the main hull section was cracked open like an egg. Its elegant curves now twisted metal bleeding atmosphere into the void. Whatever had happened here hadn't been an accident. The blast patterns were too clean, too precise. Someone had wanted this ship destroyed, and they'd done a thorough job of it. Marcus maneuvered his hauler, the stubborn mule, closer to the wreckage. His scanner sweep revealed something that made him pause. Life signs. Faint, irregular, but definitely there. Someone had survived whatever had happened here, though probably not for much longer. Well, damn, Marcus muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. He'd been out here alone for months, and finding survivors meant questions, reports, and likely a trip back to the nearest station. But he couldn't just leave someone to die in the vacuum. The survivor was in what had once been a stateroom, now open to space and held together by emergency force fields that flickered with each power fluctuation. Marcus suited up quickly, grabbing his medical kit and a portable life support unit. The artificial gravity had failed in the wreckage, so he pushed off from his airlock and drifted between the twisted beams toward the life signs. What he found made him stop and stare. Through his helmet visor, she was definitely not human. Her skin had a subtle bluish tint that seemed to shimmer in the light from his suit's lamps, and her hair was a deep violet that fell in waves around her shoulders. She was tall, probably 6.5 feet if she were standing, with proportions that were almost human but somehow more elegant, as if someone had taken a person and stretched them like a sculpture. Her face was angular but beautiful, with high cheekbones and large eyes that were currently closed, but what really caught Marcus's attention was her clothing. Even torn and stained with what he hoped wasn't blood, the fabric was clearly expensive. The cut was formal, almost ceremonial, with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow even in the wreckage's dim lighting. This wasn't some merchant or passenger. This was nobility. The alien woman was unconscious, floating in the middle of the ruined stateroom, held in place by what looked like some kind of medical restraint system. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, and Marcus's medical scanner showed severe hypothermia, dehydration, and what his limited medical knowledge suggested might be internal injuries. Okay. Sweetheart, Marcus said, though she couldn't hear him in the vacuum. Let's get you somewhere warm. Moving her was a delicate process. The medical restraints had kept her from being thrown around when the ship was destroyed, but they'd also locked her in place when the gravity failed. Marcus had to cut through the restraint cables carefully, making sure not to send her spinning into the jagged edges of the broken bulkheads. Getting her back to the stubborn mule took 20 minutes of careful maneuvering. Marcus's ship wasn't designed for passengers, but he'd modified the small cargo bay years ago to serve as a workshop, and it had basic life support. He sealed the bay, pressurized it, and carefully placed the alien woman on the makeshift medical table. He'd improvised from his workbench. With atmosphere restored, Marcus could finally remove his helmet and get a better look at his unexpected passenger. Up close, she was even more striking. Her skin wasn't just blue-tinted. It seemed to contain tiny flecks that caught the light like stars. Her breathing was still shallow, but at least it was steady. Marcus had basic medical training. Anyone who worked the Outer Rim alone had to, but treating an alien was another matter entirely. He started with the basics, warming her up, checking for obvious injuries, and trying to figure out if human medical supplies would even work on her physiology. The first surprise came when he checked her pulse. Her heart rate was much slower than a human's, but her body temperature was significantly lower too. What had seemed like severe hypothermia might actually be closer to normal for her species. The second surprise was when he tried to remove her torn clothing to check for injuries. The fabric wasn't just expensive. It was clearly high-tech. The material seemed to respond to his touch. becoming more flexible as he worked with it, as if it was trying to help him help her under the formal outer layer. She wore what looked like a medical monitoring suit, thin as silk but covered in microscopic sensors. Most of them were dark now, their power sources apparently damaged in whatever had destroyed her ship. But a few were still active, displaying readings in a script Marcus didn't recognize. What happened to you? Marcus wondered aloud as he worked. The injuries were real, enough bruising across her ribs, a gash on her left arm that had sealed itself with some kind of biological response he'd never seen before, and what looked like exhaustion so severe it was life-threatening. But the more Marcus examined his unexpected passenger, the more questions he had. Her fingernails weren't just manicured. They had tiny technological implants at their base. Her hair, which had seemed merely unusual from a distance, was actually shot through with microscopic fibers that seemed to pulse with their own light. Even unconscious and injured, she radiated a kind of presence that spoke of wealth, power, and authority. The medical monitoring suit finally gave him his first real clue. As he managed to activate one of its diagnostic systems using his ship's power supply, text began scrolling across a small display. Most of it was in that alien script, but some sections showed symbols he recognized, medical symbols that seemed to be universal. Temperature, heart rate, blood pressure, and at the top, what looked like a name, Zarathes Valandra. Zarathes? Marcus said, testing the pronunciation. Well, Zara, I hope your people are friendlier than most of the aliens I've met out here. The reference files on his ship's computer didn't have much information about her species, but what little he found made Marcus whistle low. The Valandra were mentioned in a few trade reports as one of the founding families of the Calthran Empire, a civilization that controlled several dozen star systems in this part of the galaxy. They were described as reclusive, powerful, and absolutely not to be trifled with, which raised the obvious question: what was a member of one of the most powerful families in the galaxy doing floating, unconscious in a wrecked ship in the middle of nowhere? Marcus found part of the answer when he managed to access the ship's damaged computer core. The vessel had been called the Serene Contemplation, and it had been registered as a private transport for the Valandra family. The last entry in the ship's log was time-stamped 3 days ago, and it was brief: departure from Calthran Prime, destination, exile coordinates, passenger status, sentenced. Exile, Marcus said. Someone kicked you out, didn't they? The ship's medical bay had been destroyed in whatever had happened, but Marcus found scattered medical supplies that seemed more advanced than anything in human space. Most importantly, he found what looked like an enforced system designed for her species. The fluid in the medical packs was clear, but it seemed to shimmer with the same star-like quality as her skin. Getting the system working took 2 hours of careful improvisation. Marcus had to jury-rig connections between the alien medical equipment and his ship's power systems, but eventually he managed to get fluid flowing into her system. The response was almost immediate. Her breathing deepened, and some color returned to her skin, but she still didn't wake up. Marcus set up a monitoring system and settled in to wait. The stubborn mule wasn't going anywhere until he figured out what to do with his passenger. Turning her over to authorities was the safe choice, but something about the word exile in the ship's logs made him hesitate. If her own people had kicked her out, what would happen if he brought her back to them? On the other hand, keeping her might be even more dangerous. The Calthran Empire had a reputation for being ruthless with anyone who interfered in their affairs. A simple asteroid miner helping an exiled member of their nobility could easily be seen as an act of war. Marcus made himself a cup of coffee and sat down to watch over his unexpected guest. Whatever had happened to Zarathes Valandra, she was his responsibility now. And despite the potential complications, he found himself hoping she would wake up soon. The Outer Rim was a lonely place, and it had been months since he'd had anyone to talk to. As if responding to his thoughts, her eyes fluttered open. They were large and expressive, a deep purple that seemed to contain depths he could fall into. For a moment she seemed confused, looking around the cramped cargo bay with obvious bewilderment. Then her gaze found Marcus, and he saw recognition, wariness, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Easy, Marcus said, raising his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "You're safe. I found you in the wreckage of your ship." She tried to speak but only managed a weak croak. Marcus quickly brought her a cup of water, helping her sit up enough to drink. She sipped carefully, studying his face with those remarkable purple eyes, when she spoke again. Marcus refilled Zarathis' water cup and pulled up a chair beside the improvised medical table. "Well," he said with a slight smile, "I've been making enemies accidentally for most of my life. At least this time I did it for a good reason." Zarathis studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he was serious or merely foolish. "You do not understand what the Empire does to those who interfere with their justice." "Probably not," Marcus admitted. "But I understand what happens to people who get left to die in space." That seemed more immediate than politics. She attempted to sit up further, wincing as her injuries reminded her of their presence. Marcus moved to help, but she waved him away with a gesture that managed to be both graceful and stubborn despite her weakness. "I am not accustomed to accepting help," she said. Though she didn't sound ungrateful. "Yeah, I got that impression from the royal exile thing." Marcus settled back in his chair. "You wanted to tell me what you did that was bad enough to get you kicked out of paradise?" Zarathis was quiet for so long that Marcus began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed far older than her apparent years. "I believe that ruling required serving," she said. The Imperial Court disagreed. Over the next hour, as Marcus continued monitoring her condition and making small repairs to her medical equipment, Zarathis told her story. The Calphrid Empire was ancient, powerful, and utterly rigid in its hierarchy. The Villandra family had held their position for over 1,000 years, maintaining control through careful alliances, strategic marriages, and absolute adherence to tradition. Zarathis had been raised to follow that tradition, trained from childhood to take her place in the cosmic order that kept the empire stable. But somewhere along the way, she had started asking questions that made the court uncomfortable. "I wanted to know why our mining colonies lived in poverty while the core worlds threw away food," she said, staring at the ceiling of Marcus's cargo bay. "I asked why our military focused on expanding territory instead of protecting the citizens we already had. I suggested that perhaps our ancient laws needed to be examined in light of modern realities." "Sounds reasonable to me," Marcus said, checking the readings on her medical monitors. "Reasonableness," Zarathis replied with a bitter smile, "is not a quality valued by those who benefit from unreasonable systems." The final confrontation had come when she'd tried to use her position to investigate reports of slave labor in the Empire's outer territories. The evidence she'd gathered was damning, but when she'd presented it to the Imperial Court demanding action, she'd been accused of treason against the natural order of things. "They said I was corrupted by foreign ideas," she continued, "that I had lost sight of my duty to preserve Calthran purity and strength. My own father cast the deciding vote for my exile." Marcus felt a familiar anger building in his chest. He'd grown up in the outer colonies himself, where Earth's government paid lip service to helping its frontier citizens, while focusing most of its resources on the core systems. The specifics were different, but the pattern was depressingly familiar. So they stuck you on a ship and pointed you toward empty space. The traditional exile is to be taken to the edge of Imperial territory and released with minimal supplies. It is meant to be a death sentence carried out by the universe itself, allowing the Empire to maintain the fiction that they do not execute their own nobility. "Except someone made sure you didn't even get that far." Zarathis nodded grimly. "The ship's destruction was no accident. Someone wanted to ensure that my exile became my death, quickly and quietly." Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing what he'd learned. "Any idea who?" "The list of possibilities is extensive. I made many enemies at court with my ... questions." She paused, then looked directly at Marcus. "But the method suggests someone with access to Imperial military technology. The blast patterns you showed me are consistent with our latest plasma torpedoes." Someone in your own military hunted you down? It would appear so. Marcus stood up and began pacing in the small space, a habit he'd developed during long, solitary flights. The smart thing would be to take Zarathes to the nearest neutral station, maybe find a way to contact a refugee organization or a diplomatic corps. Let someone else deal with the implications of harboring an exiled alien noble, but looking at her, seeing the exhaustion that went deeper than physical injury, Marcus found himself thinking about all the times he'd been failed by systems that were supposed to protect people like him. The colonial administrators who promised support that never came. The corporate representatives who talked about the importance of the Outer Rim while strip mining its resources. The politicians who spoke of humanity's great expansion while leaving individual humans to survive or die on their own. What would happen if you went back? He asked. Zarathes looked surprised by the question. I cannot go back. Exile is permanent. Even if I were to somehow reach Imperial space, I would be executed on sight. But what if you could prove that your exile was illegitimate? What if we could find evidence that someone used military resources to try to kill you without proper authorization? The Empire does not concern itself with such technicalities. Maybe not, Marcus said, still pacing. But people do. You said you were investigating slave labor. That means there were people you were trying to help, right? People who knew you were fighting for them? Zarathes was quiet for a moment, and Marcus could see her thinking. The mining colonies, she said slowly. They sent representatives to the capital. Workers who testified about their conditions. If they knew what had happened to me, might cause some unrest in the ranks? Perhaps. But it would also put them in great danger. Marcus stopped pacing and looked at her. Seems like they're already in danger. Question is whether they know it or not. Over the next 2 days, as Zarathes recovered her strength, Marcus found himself drawn into long conversations about politics, philosophy, and the nature of power. Despite their different backgrounds, or perhaps because of them, they discovered a remarkable amount of common ground. Zarathes was brilliant, educated in ways that Marcus could only dream of. But she was also curious about his perspective in a way that surprised him. She asked detailed questions about human colonial policy, about the social movements that had shaped Earth's expansion, about the practical challenges of maintaining infrastructure across interstellar distances. In return, Marcus learned about Calthan society, about the delicate balance of power that kept dozens of worlds functioning as a single entity, and about the deep philosophical traditions that had guided the Empire for millennia. It was a fascinating system, elegant in its complexity. But Marcus could see the cracks that Zarathes had noticed. The thing is, Marcus said on the second evening as they shared a meal of synthesized protein and whatever vegetables he'd managed to grow in his tiny hydroponics bay, most people don't want to be ruled. They want to be protected, sure, and they need coordination for big projects. But what they really want is to live their lives without someone else making all the important decisions for them. That is a very human perspective, Zarathes observed. Is it? Because from what you've told me, your mining colony workers weren't asking for someone else to rule them. They were asking for the people who were already ruling them to do a better job of it. Zarathes considered this while delicately eating what Marcus had warned her might not agree with her digestive system. To his surprise, she seemed to be adapting to human food quite well, though she ate much smaller portions than he did. You may be correct, she said finally. But the court would say that the common people do not understand the complexities of governance, that their immediate desires must sometimes be sacrificed for long-term stability. And what do you say? I say that stability built on suffering is not worth preserving. That evening, Marcus made a decision that surprised both of them. Instead of heading for the nearest neutral station, he began plotting a course for one of the border worlds where he'd heard rumors of Calthan refugees. If Zarathes was right about having supporters among the common people, then maybe there was a way to get word back to the Empire about what had really happened to her. This is dangerous for you, Zarathes warned as she watched him work. If Imperial forces discover that you are harboring me... They'll probably shoot first and ask questions later, Marcus agreed cheerfully. But you know what? I spent 3 years out here mining asteroids because I got tired of watching corrupt administrators get rich while good people suffered. Maybe it's time I did something about it. Zarathis was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft. Why? You do not know me. You owe the Calphran Empire nothing. Your own people would likely benefit if the Empire were to remain in chaos. Marcus paused in his navigation calculations and turned to look at her. In the dim lighting of the mule's cabin, her unusual features made her look like something out of a fairy tale, beautiful and otherworldly. But her expression was entirely human, confused, hopeful, and vulnerable. Back when I was growing up on Kepler Station, Marcus said, there was this old maintenance worker named Chunwei no relation, despite the name. The station's life support kept failing, and the corporate owners. The border world of Tashara Prime had seen better days. As Marcus guided the stubborn mule through the planet's scattered orbital defenses, he could see the signs of economic decline that marked so many frontier worlds. Half the docking bays were dark, the traffic control signals were irregular, and the few ships moving around the system looked like they were held together with prayer and spare parts. It's perfect, Marcus said as he requested docking clearance from the barely staffed traffic control center. Zarathis, who had been studying the planet's profile data, looked up from the display. Perfect for what? For not asking too many questions about where we came from or where we're going. Tashara Prime had been a mining world before the easily accessible deposits ran out. Now it served as a way station for traders, refugees, and anyone else who needed to keep a low profile while moving through this part of the galaxy. The planetary government was nominally allied with the Calphran Empire, but that alliance was more about survival than enthusiasm. They docked at a commercial facility that had clearly seen better days. The docking fees were reasonable, the security was minimal, and the clerk who processed their arrival paperwork seemed more interested in his card game than in their ship's registration. Welcome to paradise, Marcus said as they walked through the station's main corridor. The artificial gravity was uneven, the lighting flickered occasionally, and the air recycling system made concerning noises. But the place was alive with the kind of activity that Marcus had learned to associate with honest people working hard to get by. Zarathis attracted some attention. Her height and unusual features made her stand out even in a place accustomed to diversity, but most people were too busy with their own affairs to stare for long. Marcus had convinced her to wear some of his spare clothes, and while they didn't fit well, they helped her blend in better than her formal exile garments would have. Their first stop was a small cafe near the docking ring, where Marcus had arranged to meet a contact he'd heard about through the informal network of traders and miners who worked the Outer Rim. Yuki Tanaka was a former journalist who'd left human space after asking too many inconvenient questions about corporate mining practices. She now ran what she called a documentation service for people who needed to get information to places where official channels couldn't reach. Marcus-chan, Yuki said as they sat down at a corner table. I heard you'd gone completely native out there in the asteroid belt. Just taking some time to think, Marcus replied. Yuki, I'd like you to meet my friend Zara. She has a story that needs telling. Yuki was a small, sharp-eyed woman who seemed to take in everything at once. Her gaze lingered on Zarathis for a moment longer than politeness strictly required, but when she spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. What kind of story? Marcus looked at Zarathis, who had been unusually quiet since they'd arrived at the station. She seemed to be struggling with something, and he realized that despite all their conversations, this was probably the first time she'd been in a public space as anything other than nobility. Tell her, Marcus said quietly. These people have a right to know what the Empire really thinks of them. Zarathis straightened, and for a moment Marcus saw a flash of the authority she must have wielded before her exile. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of presence that made people listen. I am Zarathis Vilandra, she said. Until recently I was a member of the Imperial Court. I was exiled for investigating conditions in the Empire's mining colonies and attempting to present evidence of systematic abuse to the ruling Council. Yuki's expression didn't change, but Marcus saw her fingers move slightly, activating what was probably a recording device hidden in her clothing. What kind of evidence? Forced labor contracts that amount to slavery. Safety violations that have killed thousands of workers. Deliberate policies designed to keep the colonies dependent on the core worlds. Zarathes paused, then added, and assassination squads sent to eliminate inconvenient witnesses. That's a serious accusation. My exile ship was destroyed by Imperial military weapons 3 days after leaving Calfrin Prime. If Marcus had not found me, the destruction of the Serene Contemplation would have been reported as an unfortunate accident. Yuki was quiet for a long moment, studying both of them. Finally, she leaned forward. I've been documenting conditions in the Calfrin territories for 2 years, she said. I have testimonies from dozens of workers, records of suspicious deaths, shipping manifests that don't add up. But I've never had anyone from the inside willing to go on record. I am willing, Zarathes said simply. What followed was 3 hours of detailed questioning. Yuki was thorough, professional, and clearly experienced at getting information from people who had every reason to be cautious. Zarathes answered every question directly, providing names, dates, and specifics that painted a picture of systematic corruption at the highest levels of the empire. Marcus found himself impressed by both women. Yuki's questions revealed a deep understanding of how the empire worked, while Zarathes displayed a remarkable memory for detail and an obvious commitment to accuracy even when the facts reflected poorly on her own family. This is enough to start a revolution, Yuki said when they finished. If the right people see this, if it gets distributed properly? How long before word gets back to the Empire that she's alive? Marcus asked. Hard to say. I've got secure channels, but nothing's completely secure when you're dealing with Imperial intelligence services. A few days, maybe a week if we're lucky. That evening, as they sat in Marcus's ship planning their next move, Zarathes seemed lost in thought. The interview with Yuki had been emotionally draining, and Marcus could see the weight of what she'd committed to settling on her shoulders. Having second thoughts? He asked. No, she said. But I am realizing that there is no path back to my old life. Even if the Empire were to somehow forgive my exile, I can never again be the person who believed that the system could be reformed from within. Maybe that's not a bad thing, perhaps not. But it is difficult to let go of everything you thought you were. Marcus understood. He'd gone through something similar when he'd left human space. Realizing that the dreams he'd grown up with about humanity's great expansion were mostly propaganda designed to keep people like him content with scraps. So what do you want to be instead? Zarathes was quiet for a long time. When she finally answered, her voice was thoughtful. I want to be someone who helps people instead of ruling them. The next morning brought complications. Marcus was running a routine check on his ship's systems when his proximity alarms went off. 3 ships had just dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system sleek. Predatory vessels that his database immediately identified as Calfrin Imperial Navy cruisers. Well, Marcus said. Watching the tactical display, that was faster than expected. Zarathes joined him at the controls, her face grave as she studied the approaching ships. Eclipse-class cruisers, she said. Fast, heavily armed, and specifically designed for operations in neutral territory. They must have been tracking us since we left the wreckage site. How long before they get here? At maximum burn? 6 hours. Marcus began running calculations. The Stubborn Mule was a good ship, but she was built for cargo hauling, not running from military vessels. In a straight chase, the cruisers would catch them easily. We need to get off this station, he said. Where can we go? They'll track us wherever we run? Marcus smiled grimly. Who said anything about running? Over the next hour, Marcus implemented a plan that was either brilliantly simple or completely insane. Using the station's public communication system, he sent out a general broadcast to every ship in the system. The message was brief. A member of the Imperial Court was currently on Tashara Prime, and she had evidence of crimes against the Empire's own citizens. Anyone who wanted to hear the truth about the conditions in the mining colonies was invited to dock at Bay 94 for a live broadcast. "You're going to get us killed," Zarathis said as Marcus finished setting up the broadcasting equipment he'd borrowed from Yuki. "Maybe," Marcus agreed. "But I'm also going to make it very expensive for them to kill us quietly." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 2 hours, more than 50 ships had docked at or near the station. Traders, miners, transport crews, and even a few vessels that looked suspiciously like they might belong to various intelligence services. Word was spreading through the system's communication networks, and people were coming to hear what Zarathis had to say. By the time the Imperial cruisers arrived at Tashara Prime, they found themselves facing not a simple extraction mission, but a potential diplomatic incident. Hundreds of people from dozens of different worlds were watching as Zarathis told her story to a live audience that was being broadcast across multiple networks. "The Empire teaches that order and stability require sacrifice," she said, standing in the makeshift studio that Yuki and Marcus had set up in the station's main conference room. "But they do not tell you who is expected to make those sacrifices or who benefits from your suffering." The evidence she presented was damning. Names, dates, shipping records, testimonies from workers who had risked everything to speak out. As she talked, Marcus monitored the communication channels, and